The ship came without warning. It did not arrive with lights or music or any of the things humanity had imagined for decades when they dreamed of first contact. It arrived like a shadow, slow, vast, and completely silent. It dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system at exactly 3 a.m, Greenwich Mean Time, and within 6 minutes, every telescope, satellite, and deep space sensor array on Earth and beyond had locked onto it. The ship was enormous, not large in the way that aircraft carriers or skyscrapers are large. It was large in the way that mountains are large, the kind of big that makes the human brain go quiet because it simply has no reference point. It was 7 kilometers from end to end, shaped like a wedge, and its surface was the color of old bone. Behind it, in a long, patient line stretching back into the dark, came 4,000 more. Admiral Yara Osei was in her command chair on the bridge of the EDF Resolute when the alert came in. She had been awake for 19 hours already, dealing with a supply dispute near the Jupiter stations, and she had been about to get coffee. She put the mug down without drinking from it. She looked at the screen. She looked at it for a long time. "Someone wake up the Secretary General," she said. The fleet was identified within the hour. Every xenolinguistics team on Earth was pulled from their beds. 12 governments held emergency sessions. The United Nations Security Council convened in a room that smelled of cold coffee and fear. Scientists ran numbers and ran them again, and then sat very still because the numbers did not change. The alien fleet outnumbered Earth's entire defense force by more than 13 to 1. Earth's defense fleet, the Combined Space Defense Force, built over 60 years at enormous cost, had 312 active warships. They were, humanity had believed until this morning, the most powerful weapons ever made by human hands. Looking at the readouts now, Admiral Osei felt something shift quietly inside her chest. The aliens did not speak for 11 hours. Then they did. The signal came on every frequency at once. Every radio, every phone, every screen on Earth received it simultaneously. There was a sound first, a low, layered tone that seemed to press on the ears. And then a voice. It spoke in perfect, unaccented English, which meant they had been listening for a very long time. The voice was calm and flat, like someone reading a shopping list. "This communication is addressed to the biological entities designated as humans, inhabitants of the third planet of this star system. You are in violation of Galactic Conclave Territorial Expansion Protocols, Articles 7 through 22. Your unauthorized colonization of 14 planetary bodies and your development of military-grade faster-than-light technology without Conclave authorization constitutes a threat to galactic order. You have 72 of your hours to comply with the following terms." The terms were not complicated. They were, in their way, almost tidy. Humanity would disarm completely. All warships would be surrendered. Earth and its colonies would become a protectorate of the Galactic Conclave, which meant, as far as anyone could understand it, a territory owned and administered by beings who had just shown up in the dark and spoken to 8 billion people like they were a paperwork problem to be sorted. The voice concluded, "Non-compliance will result in the removal of your civilization's capacity to resist. This is not a negotiation." The transmission ended. For 3 seconds, Earth was completely silent. Then, all at once, it was not. The UN chamber erupted. 17 representatives tried to speak at the same time. The American president's feed dropped twice. The Chinese premier stared at the ceiling. The Indian defense minister put her face in her hands. Someone knocked over a glass of water, and nobody moved to clean it up. In the middle of all of this, the alien envoy arrived. It came in a small shuttle, smooth and dark, which docked at the ISS-4 orbital platform without asking permission. There were 6 of them, tall, gray-skinned, with 4 arms and eyes that caught light strangely, like deep water. Their leader called himself Envoy Prime Sithar, and he walked into the emergency chamber that had been hastily arranged on the platform, with the careful, unhurried confidence of a man who owns everything in the room. He looked around slowly. He looked at the walls, at the furniture, at the humans standing and sitting and staring at him. His expression, as best anyone could read it, was that of a person visiting a neighborhood that has not been kept up. "We expected more resistance by now," he said pleasantly. "Previous species have usually attempted some kind of aggressive posture at this point. It is, of course, pointless, but it tends to make them feel better." Admiral Ose, who had joined the platform via shuttle 2 hours earlier, stood at the back of the room and watched him. She said nothing. The Secretary-General of the United Nations, a small, quiet man from Senegal named Amadou Diallo, sat at the head of the table and listened to everything Sithar said. He listened without interrupting, which appeared to surprise the envoy. He let Sithar explain the terms again, slower this time, as if speaking to someone with a learning difficulty. He let Sithar describe the conclave, its 200-member species, its 40,000 years of unbroken authority, its perfect record of enforcing compliance. He let Sithar say that Earth's history of violent conflict made humans uniquely unqualified for self-governance on an interstellar scale. When Sithar finished, Diallo folded his hands on the table. "We will need the 72 hours to consider," he said. Sithar smiled, which was not a pleasant thing to see. "Of course," he said. "I should mention, however, that in 31 prior situations of this type, not one species has found a reason to refuse after reviewing the terms carefully. I suspect you will reach the same conclusion." "I suspect we will reach a conclusion," Diallo agreed. Back on the Resolute, Admiral Ose stood at the viewport and looked at the alien fleet. She had run the battle projections herself, quietly, while the diplomats talked. She had run them 14 times using different variables. Every single simulation ended the same way. Her comms officer appeared at her shoulder. "Admiral, message from Fleet Command. They're asking for your assessment." She was quiet for a moment. "Tell them I need to make a call first," she said. "A private one." She went to her office, closed the door, and sat at her desk. She did not make a call. She opened a sealed file instead, one with a clearance level so high that only 11 people on Earth could access it. She had not opened it in 4 years. She read it now, all of it. Then she sat very still for a while. Then slowly, she began to smile. Sithar, back on his flagship, was eating dinner and reviewing compliance projections when his aide brought him the human response. It had arrived early, 31 hours before the deadline. He was mildly impressed by the efficiency. He assumed it was a surrender document with perhaps some minor requests attached. Species always tried to negotiate small dignities at the end. He opened it. It was 2 words. "Come then." Sithar stared at it. He read it 3 more times. He set down his food. He called for his tactical officer. "Begin the orbital bombardment sequence," he said. "Target the population centers first. Make it visible. They need to understand what they have chosen." The bombardment began at dawn over the Pacific. The weapons were clean and precise, focused energy beams that could strip a city down to bare earth in under a minute. Sithar watched the targeting data on his screen with the mild attention of someone completing routine paperwork. The beams hit. There was nothing there. Not rubble, not fires, not ruins, nothing. Where 8 million people had been living in a coastal city 12 hours ago, there was flat, undisturbed ground. "Recalibrate," Sithar said. They recalibrated. They fired again. Another city, empty. A third, empty. A fourth. They swept the entire coastline of one continent and found nothing but grass and rock and old roads leading to nowhere. Sithar's tactical officer turned from her station slowly. Her face had gone very still. "Sir," she said, "we are detecting new contacts. Many contacts. They are not coming from the planet's surface." She paused. "They are coming from below it." Sithar stood at the tactical display for a very long time. His officers were quiet. They understood, from years of working with him, that there were moments when speaking was dangerous, and this was one of them. The contact readings kept updating. More signatures, More ships. More and more and more. Appearing on the sensors like stars coming out after sunset. 1. Then 5. Then 50. Then hundreds. Emerging not from deep space, but from beneath the surface of the planet he had just spent an hour trying to destroy. That is not possible, he said to no one in particular. No one disagreed with him. It was not possible. And yet, the ships were rising from beneath the crust of Earth itself, from beneath the oceans, from beneath the plains, from beneath the mountain ranges his weapons had just reduced to gravel. They were coming up through reinforced launch tunnels, bored vertically through kilometers of rock, and as each one cleared the surface, it ignited its drives and climbed, steady and deliberate, toward the dark. They were not scrambling. They were not panicking. They were rising the way a tide rises, with complete and patient inevitability. Sithar counted 14,000 before he stopped counting. In the hollows, the lights had been on for hours. Dmitry Volkov was 34 years old, and had never seen the sky, except on screens. He had been born in Hollow 7, carved into the mantle, beneath what had once been the Siberian plain, in a city of 2 million people, who lived under rock and recycled air and artificial sunlight that cycled on a 24-hour schedule. He was an engineer, third generation. His grandfather had dug the first tunnels. His mother had built the water recyclers. He maintained the launch systems. He stood now at his monitoring station in Launch Bay 41 and watched the ships go up, one every 90 seconds, running on a schedule that had been prepared and rehearsed for 11 years. He had run this launch sequence in simulation 412 times. He had never expected to run it for real. Now that he was running it for real, he found that his hands were very steady. His colleague Priya leaned over from the station beside him. "How does it feel?" He thought about it. "Like finishing a very long project," he said. The hollows were not new. The oldest of them dated back to 2089, dug quietly, secretly, during a period when Earth's governments had publicly been arguing about Mars colonization funding, and privately had been terrified of what first contact might bring. The arguments had been made in classified rooms. Humanity was loud, combative, and visible. If there was anything out there, it would find them. And when it found them, it might not be friendly. The surface was exposed. The surface was a target. So they had built underground. It had taken generations and the combined industrial output of a dozen nations, working in coordination behind elaborate cover stories. Wars had been fought partly as distractions. Economic crises had been manufactured to explain the movement of resources. An entire shadow civilization had been constructed beneath the one that everyone could see, and the secret had been kept because everyone who knew understood what was at stake, if it was not. There were 22 hollows in total, 9 on Earth, 5 on Mars, 3 in the asteroid belt, carved into the rock of large planetoids, 2 on Titan, using the moon's thick atmosphere as additional cover, 1 each on Callisto and Ganymede. They housed a combined population of 340 million people, roughly 4% of humanity, but they contained disproportionately large shares of humanity's manufacturing capacity, its research facilities, its fuel reserves, and its military shipyards. The ships had been built in those yards, quietly, over decades. They were not the polished, treaty-compliant vessels of the official Combined Space Defense Force. They were warships, in the truest sense, heavy, fast, and built for a single purpose. Their crews had trained for years. Their commanders had studied every piece of intelligence humanity had gathered on alien weapons technology, which was not much, but was more than Sithar would have expected. Admiral Yara Osei's voice came over the command channel with the same unhurried calm she used when ordering coffee. "All Hollow Fleet units, this is Admiral Osei. Launch sequence is on schedule. Formation Sierra 9 once you clear atmosphere. Weapons hold until my signal. Let's be professional about this." On the Conclave flagship, Sithar had stopped being confused and started being afraid. It was not a feeling he was accustomed to. He had overseen 11 compliance operations in his career. He had watched 9 civilizations fold within hours of the ultimatum. He had watched 2 resist and be destroyed. He had never, in 40 years of service, encountered a species that had been waiting for him. "Their fleet is forming up around us," his tactical officer said. Her voice was very controlled. 13,844 vessels confirmed. They are in full encirclement formation. She paused. "We are surrounded, sir." "I can see that. Their weapons are not active." He looked at that data point and turned it over in his mind. Weapons not active. They had the numbers. They had the position. They could open fire right now, and it would be over in an hour. But their weapons were not active. A channel opened. Admiral Osei's face appeared on his screen. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and very calm dark eyes. She looked like someone who had slept well. "Envoy Prime Sithar," she said, "I believe the situation has changed somewhat since this morning. I'd like to propose we return to the table." He stared at her. You hid. You built all of this and you hid it." "We prepared," she said pleasantly. "It is a thing humans do." "You cannot expect to." He stopped. He started again. "The Conclave Grand Armada will respond to any hostile action. 200,000 warships. You cannot fight that." She tilted her head slightly. "No," she agreed. "Not right now. But we're not planning to fight you right now. We're planning to talk to you. Talking is better. Talking is what we should have been doing from the beginning, before you flew 4,000 ships to our home and told us to kneel." A pause. "We don't kneel well. I probably should have mentioned that earlier." Scythar's aide touched his arm quietly. He leaned in close and spoke in a whisper. Scythar's expression did not change. He nodded once. He had already sent the signal. It had gone out the moment his sensors confirmed the scale of the human fleet. An automatic emergency protocol, triggered by a set of conditions he had never expected to meet. It had taken 2 seconds. It was already done. The Conclave Grand Armada had been summoned. 200,000 ships. 6 weeks away. He looked at Admiral Osei on his screen and decided that she did not need to know that yet. "Very well," he said. "We will talk." In Hollow 7, Dmitry Volkov watched the last of his launch base ships clear the surface. The bay was empty now, just the long dark tunnel going up, and the smell of propellant and hot metal. He had been working toward this moment for 11 years. He thought he would feel something dramatic. He mostly felt tired. He pulled out his phone and called his mother, who lived in Hollow 3 beneath the North Atlantic. "It started," he said when she answered. She was quiet for a moment. "Is Yara up there?" "She's already commanding," he said. "Good," his mother said. "Then we'll be all right." He was not certain that was true. But he found, listening to her voice, in the quiet of the empty bay, the galaxy was watching. That was not a metaphor. The Galactic Conclave had a communications network that linked every inhabited system in the Milky Way. And word of what had happened at the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star spread through that network at the speed of light, which, given the scale of the galaxy, meant it took weeks to reach the furthest members. But the nearer ones knew within days. And those who knew told others, and soon there was not a species within 300 light-years that was not following the situation with the kind of focused, anxious attention usually reserved for natural disasters. A human fleet had appeared from beneath the surface of their own planet. The Conclave ultimatum had been refused. Envoy Prime Sithar, known for 11 successful compliance operations, was sitting in orbit around Earth, surrounded and waiting for the Grand Armada. The general consensus across the galaxy was that humanity had 6 weeks to live. Most species, when they discussed it, seemed genuinely sorry about this. The humans were strange and loud and had done several things that violated Conclave regulations without apparently noticing that the Conclave existed. But they had also produced music that some other species found interesting, and mathematical proofs that a few found impressive. It was a shame, the general opinion went, that they had to be destroyed. But they had refused to kneel, and no one refused to kneel and survived. That was simply how things were. Vera Keth, a young xenologist from a species called the Aflame, was one of the few voices saying otherwise. She had been assigned to the compliance operation as an observer. The Aflame were a conclave member species, technically, though they had joined under circumstances that most of them preferred not to discuss. And she had been watching humanity very carefully for 3 years before this moment arrived. She sat in her small cabin aboard the conclave observation vessel and looked at the data feeds from Earth with the growing, uncomfortable feeling that everyone around her was about to be very surprised. She filed a report. It was 9,000 words long. It argued, with careful citations, that humanity's industrial capacity had been deliberately and systematically understated in all conclave intelligence assessments, and that the true scale of their manufacturing output was not known. It argued that a species capable of secretly building and hiding 14,000 warships was almost certainly capable of building more. It suggested that the 6-week window was not a death sentence, but a production run. The report was acknowledged, categorized as low priority, and filed. She filed another one, shorter this time, more direct. It said simply, "They are not panicking. Watch them. When a species knows it is about to die, it panics. They are not panicking." This one was also filed. She went back to watching. On Earth, the surface cities were empty in the official sense. All residents had been underground for years, though many had maintained upper-level facades for the sake of appearances. Now there was no reason to maintain appearances. The facades came down, the launch tunnels were opened to their full diameter, and the shipyards, which had been running at 30% capacity to avoid generating heat signatures that conclave sensors might detect, went to full production. The change was immediate and staggering. A ship that had previously taken 8 months to build was being completed in 11 weeks. Materials that had been stockpiled in hollow cargo bays for years were being moved to assembly floors. Workers ran double shifts without being asked. In Hollow 7, Dmitry Volkov authorized a modification to the launch rail timing system that allowed a new vessel to be pushed to the surface every 40 minutes instead of every 90. And when he told the crew they would need to work through the next 3 nights to implement it, there was no complaint. They simply started working. At a hollow research station under the Martian South Pole, a team of 41 physicists and engineers were completing a device they called, in their internal documents, the Cascade Pulse Generator. It was, in simple terms, a weapon, one that fired not at ships, but at the dark matter gradients that faster-than-light drives used to function. A fleet that arrived in tight formation, as the Grand Armada would, presented a single interconnected dark matter field. In theory, a powerful enough cascade pulse would collapse that field all at once, shutting down every drive in the formation simultaneously. In theory. The device had never been tested at scale. The lead physicist, Dr. Lin Hao, had been working on the underlying mathematics for 19 years. She was 61 years old, and had not slept more than 4 hours a night since the ultimatum arrived. She did not stop to think about whether it would work. She worked on the assumption that it would, because the alternative was not one she found useful to consider. Admiral Osei used the 6 weeks in other ways too. She dispatched quiet missions, small, fast ships with small crews and specific instructions, to 7 star systems, where Conclave's member species had long and complicated histories with the organization they were technically part of. The Aethrani, the Vorath, the Shen-Ka, species that had not joined the Conclave freely, or that had joined freely but had since found the terms of membership less appealing than advertised. The missions were not military. They carried no weapons larger than defensive systems. What they carried was information, specifically, a detailed accounting of the compliance operations the Conclave had carried out over the past 400 years, drawn from intelligence gathered over decades. They also carried a document called the Sol Compact, which was a proposed framework for a different kind of galactic arrangement, one based on voluntary membership, shared defense, and the novel principle that no species should be able to show up at another species' home planet and tell them to kneel. 3 species responded positively within 10 days. One of them, the Vorath, who had been Conclave members for 200 years, and had spent most of that time quietly resenting it, sent back not just an agreement, but something more immediately useful. A complete set of Conclave fleet tactical codes, obtained by a Vorath communications officer, who had been waiting for exactly this moment for 11 years. Sci-Fi, conducting his negotiations with Admiral Osei in careful circular conversations that neither party expected to resolve anything, noticed after 3 weeks that his encrypted channels felt different. He could not explain it precisely. They were functioning normally. But he had been in intelligence work long enough to recognize the particular quality of a communication network that has been compromised. And what he felt now had that quality. He said nothing about it. He smiled and talked and waited for the Armada. At the end of week 5, Vera Keth filed her 3rd report. It was 2 sentences. Current human fleet strength, 31,000 vessels. In 6 weeks, starting from a position of apparent defeat, this species has increased its military capacity by more than double. I recommend the Grand Armada be advised to expect something unprecedented. This report was not filed. It was escalated. It arrived on the desk of Armada Fleet Marshal Doro Vesh 4 hours before his fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. He read it while his bridge crew completed final approach calculations. He was a methodical man, unimpressed by dramatic warnings, and he had personally overseen the destruction of 2 species that had refused Conclave compliance orders. He read the report twice, set it down, and concluded that 31,000 ships was still a fraction of his 200,000. He was not wrong about the numbers. He was wrong about what that meant. Week 6 ended at 17 minutes past 9 in the morning, Earth time. The Grand Armada exited faster-than-light travel in a dense close formation. 200,000 ships dropping into normal space in a coordinated burst that registered on sensors across the inner solar system like a shout. They emerged exactly where Doro Vesh had calculated they would, at the edge of Earth's gravity well, positioned for a direct approach. They found 31,000 human warships waiting in a calm, spread formation. And behind the human fleet, in low Earth orbit, barely visible in the sensor data, a single unmarked ship that appeared to be doing nothing at all. Admiral Osei opened a channel to the Grand Armada before Doro Vesh could speak. "Fleet Marshal," she said, "my name is Admiral Yara Osei. You've come a long way. I'd like to offer you the same thing I offered Envoy Prime Scythar 6 weeks ago." Doro Vesh looked at the sensor data, at the 31,000 ships, at the tactical codes his navigation system was quietly flagging as potentially compromised, at the small unmarked ship. "And what is that?" he said. "A chance to talk," she said, "before something happens that neither of us can take back." Doro Vesh looked at her for a moment. 200,000 ships against 31,000. The math was not complicated. "Open fire," he said. The Grand Armada's front line fired in a coordinated full salvo. The space between the 2 fleets lit up, bright, terrible, beautiful in the way that destruction can be beautiful when it is far away. It lasted 4 seconds. Then the unmarked ship in low Earth orbit activated. The pulse was invisible. It moved at the speed of light. It touched every Conclave ship in the formation at almost exactly the same moment. And what it did to each one was simple. It collapsed the dark matter gradient around the drive core, completely and without warning, and every drive in the Grand Armada went silent simultaneously. 200,000 ships, adrift, dark. The shots they had fired were still traveling. They would not stop. Some of them would hit. The shots that the Grand Armada had already fired kept moving. There were thousands of them. Beams of focused energy and kinetic rounds traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, and nothing could stop them now. They crossed the space between the 2 fleets in seconds. Some were caught by the human fleet's defensive systems, burning out in brief, bright flashes. Some were not. Several struck the outer human formation, and 3 ships were destroyed outright, and 11 more were badly damaged, and 44 people died in the first minute of a battle that never really started. After that, there was silence. 200,000 Conclave warships floated without power, scattered across the approach zone like stones dropped in water. Their weapons were offline. Their drives were offline. Their shields were offline. They were, functionally, 200,000 very large and very expensive pieces of furniture. Admiral Osei gave the human fleet the order they had not been expecting. Hold fire. All units hold fire. Begin rescue and containment operations. Any Conclave vessel in distress gets aid first, no exceptions. There was a pause on the command channel that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then every unit confirmed and began to move. Fleet Marshal Dorovesh was standing at his bridge viewport, looking at the human ships moving through his disabled fleet, when Admiral Osei's face appeared on his screen again. His own ship was dark, except for emergency lighting. He had no weapons. He had no way to run. He was, for the first time in a career spanning 4 decades, completely helpless. "I'm sending medical teams to vessels that are reporting casualties," Osei said. "We're also going to bring fuel cells to ships that have lost life support. It is cold out here, and I don't want anyone to freeze." He stared at her. "Why?" he said. She seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because they're people, and because what comes next is going to be harder if a lot of people are dead." What came next was a broadcast. It went out on every frequency that the Conclave communications network used, and it reached every inhabited system that the network connected. And it was not a victory speech, and it was not a threat. It was a list. Admiral Osei read it herself, in a clear and steady voice, without editorial comment of any kind. She named the Velhari, whose homeworld had been stripped of all resources over 200 years of Conclave administration, and whose population now lived on food rations supplied by the same organization that had taken everything they once grew themselves. She named the Dasani, who had resisted a compliance operation 40 years ago and lost 90% of their population before the survivors agreed to terms. She named the Lex Sorai, who had no fleet and no weapons, and had complied immediately when the Conclave arrived at their system, and whose territory had been divided between 3 larger species as a reward for their cooperation, and who now existed as a minority population on their own homeworld. She named 12 other species. She named worlds. She named dates. She named numbers, populations before and after, territories before and after, resources extracted and not returned. It took 11 minutes. She did not say these things were wrong. She did not ask anyone to feel a particular way about them. She just named them, one by one, in a voice that was completely without drama, and let the galaxy listen. Sithar, who was still aboard his flagship in Earth's orbit, listened to the whole broadcast. Afterward, he sat in his cabin and stared at the wall for a while. He had been part of 3 of those compliance operations. He had been an aide during one, and a tactical officer during another, and had commanded one himself. They had seemed at the time like logistics problems, resource allocation, species management. He had not thought about them the way this broadcast made him think about them now. He was still sitting there when a human ensign knocked on his cabin door and asked, politely, if he wanted anything to eat. He did not know how to respond to this. He had been a prisoner, technically, for 6 weeks. He had been given clean quarters, regular meals, and medical attention when he had developed a respiratory irritation in week 3. He had not been interrogated. He had not been threatened. No one had been cruel to him, or even particularly unfriendly. The young ensign who brought his meals had over time started staying a few minutes to talk, about nothing important, usually, the ensign's home city, the food differences between Earth's continents, a book the ensign had been reading. He had found this more disorienting than any interrogation would have been. "Yes," he said, to the ensign's question about food. "Whatever is available." The ensign nodded and left, and Sithar sat with the strange feeling that had been growing in him for weeks, a feeling he could not name precisely, except that it had something to do with the difference between the civilization he had expected to find here and the one he had actually found. Elsewhere in the galaxy, the conclave was fracturing. It happened quickly, the way structures fail quickly once the first crack appears. The conclave's authority had always rested on the credibility of its military enforcement. Without that, it was a bureaucracy. And bureaucracies that species had joined under duress and remained in out of fear were not stable structures once the fear was removed. The Vorath declared independence 11 hours after the broadcast. The Athrani Council voted to suspend conclave membership 3 days later, following a session that lasted 20 hours and involved a great deal of shouting. 7 other species followed within a week. Then 20. The Conclave High Council, meeting in emergency session, found itself issuing directives to member species who were no longer answering their channels. Vera Keth was on a transport heading back to Athrani space when her government recalled her. She spent the journey writing, in her private notes, a long analysis of what she had seen. She had been trained to study alien species, to catalog their biology, their social structures, their technology. She had not been trained for this. She wrote, "The thing that is hardest to explain to those who were not present is that humanity did not seem surprised by any of this. They prepared for a confrontation that had not yet arrived. They built for a war that had not yet been declared. They kept secrets that required the cooperation of billions of people across generations without a single significant breach. And then when the confrontation finally came, they did not destroy their enemy. They offered medical care and food and the names of the people their enemy had harmed. I have studied 40 species in my career. I do not have a category for this." The cost, though, the real cost, was not in the documents and broadcasts and diplomatic channels. It was in the lists on the memorial screens in the hollows, the 3 ships lost in that single volley, the 44 names, the 112 injured, some of whom would not fully recover, the colony on Titan's second settlement ring that had been struck by a long-range shot during the first engagement 6 weeks ago, 11 people, none of them military, who had been in the wrong place when Sithar panicked and fired on the evacuation platforms by mistake. Dmitry Volkov went to the memorial screen in Hollow 7 and stood in front of it for a long time. He had not known any of the names personally. He stood there anyway, because it seemed important to stand there, to not let the names be something that happened elsewhere and was only heard about afterward. There were people crying, some of them quietly and some not. There were people standing in silence. There was a woman near the back of the crowd who had brought a small child, maybe 5 years old, and was holding the child's hand and answering questions in a low voice. The child was asking something about stars. The woman kept her voice level. Then he went back to work, because there was still a great deal of it left. On the human flagship, Admiral Osei was reading a report from the Conclave High Council when her comms officer interrupted. "Admiral, priority signal from our intelligence unit in the Galactic Core Sector." She set the report down. "What kind of priority?" The comms officer was young and usually very composed. He was not composed now. "They've activated something," he said. "The Conclave High Council. A weapon, something old, built 10,000 years ago and never used. It's called the Ember Throne, and it's the size of a small moon, and it's already moving. And our analysts have 17 different assessments of what it does, and all 17 assessments say the same thing." Osei looked at him. "Tell me," she said. "It sterilizes star systems," he said. "The nearest inhabited system to its current trajectory is 4 hours away. The one after that is 3 hours beyond that. It doesn't stop, Admiral. It keeps moving until someone turns it off, and no one alive knows how to turn it off." The Ember Throne was not fast. That was the first thing Admiral Osei noted when the complete intelligence report came in. It moved at sublight speed, which meant it would take days to reach the first inhabited system rather than hours. The initial estimate had been based on incomplete data. That was good. Days were better than hours. Days meant there was time. Whether there was enough time was a different question. Dr. Lin Hao came to the Admiral's briefing room via secure comms link from the Martian station, wearing the expression of someone who had not slept in 2 days but was functioning on pure problem focus. She had been working on the Ember Throne's technical profile since the alert came in, using sensor data gathered by the intelligence ships that had spotted it. She pulled up her analysis on the shared screen. "It has a power matrix," she said. "Old technology. We think pre-conclave or very early conclave based on the architecture. The key is here." She pointed to a section of the diagram. "The dark matter pulse generator works by introducing a cascade into the gradient field surrounding a drive core. The Ember Throne's power matrix uses a very similar principle. It's what allows it to sustain output across such a large area." Osei leaned forward. "You're saying we can use the pulse on it?" "I'm saying the mathematics suggest it's possible," Hao said carefully. "If a pulse of sufficient power were directed through the matrix's own gradient field, it would collapse inward rather than outward. Everything would shut down at once. A pause. Permanently." "How much power?" "More than we can generate at distance. The pulse attenuates over space. We know this. The device would need to be inside the Ember Throne's outer field boundary to deliver enough energy. Approximately 2 kilometers from the outer hull." Osei was quiet for a moment. "That's inside the kill radius." "Yes," Hao said, "by a considerable margin." The room was very still. Hao said she had spent the last 8 hours looking for one, and the answer was no. The signal degraded too much over distance. It had to be a crewed ship. It had to be close. There was no way to get the crew out before the detonation. Osei ended the call. She sat for a while in the quiet room. Then she stood up and sent the request. It was not an order. She was very specific about that. The message went out on an open channel to every human vessel in the system, military and civilian, hollow crew and surface personnel and orbital station staff. It said what the situation was. It said what was needed. It said that a crew of not more than 15 was required to fly a modified pulse ship into the Ember Throne's field boundary and trigger a detonation from which they would not return. It said that no one was required to volunteer. It said that anyone who did volunteer should understand completely and clearly what they were choosing. It also said, respond within 1 hour. Within 3 minutes, 40,000 people had responded. The Vorath ambassador, who was present on the flagship for preliminary Sol Compact discussions, watched the response counter update on the shared screen. He watched it for a while, without speaking. He had been a diplomat for 30 years, and had worked with dozens of species. He had never seen anything like this. He turned to the young human lieutenant standing beside him. "Does this not frighten them?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. The lieutenant thought about it. "Of course it does," she said, "but that doesn't stop them." He thought about this for a long time afterward. 12 people were chosen, not the first to respond, and not the bravest in any measurable sense. Those were judgments no one could make. The selection was practical. Specific technical skills, familiarity with the modified pulse system, psychological profiles that suggested stability under the particular kind of pressure this mission required. The crew lead was a chief engineer named Tobias Reinhold, 51 years old, from a hollow community under the Swiss Alps. The others came from 7 different countries and 3 different hollow settlements and 2 orbital postings. They had 4 hours before the mission window opened. Tobias spent the first hour with the ship, going over the modifications, running checks, understanding exactly what the vessel could and could not do. He was a thorough man. He did not like doing things without understanding them first. He spent the second hour recording a message for his daughter. She was 23 and working in the Hollow Medical Division. He did not know what to say to her, which was nothing new. They had not always found it easy to talk. He said that he was proud of her. He said that the work she did mattered. He said some other things that he would not have known how to say in person, which was, he thought, one of the cruel advantages of a situation like this. The usual awkwardness about saying true things disappeared when there was no time left for awkwardness. He sent the message. Then he went to the ship's small common area where the rest of the crew had gathered. Two of them, a pilot named Amara and a systems engineer named Koji, were arguing about coffee. Not in a stressed way, in the way people who know each other well argue about small things, with enthusiasm and without any real intent to resolve anything. Amara maintained that strong coffee was an objective good. Koji maintained that Amara had the palate of a person who had never actually tasted anything. They had apparently been having this argument for several years. An engineer named Fatoumata was in the corner, reading on a small tablet. Tobias asked what she was reading. She showed him. It was a collection of poems, old ones from many different languages, translated into a common edition. She said she had been meaning to read it for years, and had kept putting it off. "Seems like a good time," Tobias said. "Seems like the best time," she agreed. They launched at the second hour. The mission took 6 hours in total, 4 to reach the Ember Throne, which was moving away from them, and 2 to close the distance once they matched its trajectory. They flew in silence for most of it. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that happens among people who have said what needs saying and are now just present with each other. The Ember Throne was visible on sensors for the last 3 hours, and visible to the eye for the last 40 minutes. It was not beautiful. It was a dark, irregular mass, ancient and cold, and it moved with the mechanical patience of something that had been set in motion a very long time ago, and had never been given reason to stop. Tobias made his last log entry at 12 minutes out. This is Chief Engineer Tobias Reinhold, crew lead of the mission designated Ember 1. All systems are nominal. Crew is ready. We are proceeding as planned. A pause. The math is right, Dr. Howe. I checked it myself. It's going to work. At 2 kilometers from the outer hull, Koji triggered the pulse. The flash was visible from Earth. People in the hollows had set up surface cameras in the months since the crisis began, feeding images to screens below ground, and the night side of Earth saw a brief, very bright light appear in the direction of the galactic core. Not threatening, not close, just a moment of brightness in the dark. And then it was gone. The Ember Throne's power matrix collapsed completely. Every system aboard shut down at once. The weapon that had moved without stopping for 10,000 years stopped. It floated, silent and dark, in the space between stars. The months that followed were complicated and often difficult, in the way that large changes are always complicated and difficult. The Conclave High Council formally dissolved itself after extended negotiations in which it had very little leverage. 43 species signed the Sol Compact in its first form, with more expected to follow. Sithar returned to his homeworld, and after a period of private quiet, began writing and speaking publicly about what he had witnessed, what he had expected, and what he had found instead. It was not comfortable writing. He was not a comfortable person afterward. But he was honest, which was more than most expected of him. Vera Keth published her study 18 months later. Its title was The Irrational Variable: Why Every Model We Use to Understand Humanity Was Wrong. It became, in translation, one of the most widely read documents in the galaxy for several years, which she found both gratifying and slightly embarrassing. Dmitry Volkov never left the Hollows for good, though he traveled more than he had before. He helped design the first multi-species Hollow settlement, a shared underground city on a neutral world, built by Vorath engineers and Aethrani architects and human diggers, which became a strange and improbable and occasionally argumentative community. He liked it very much. Admiral Yara Osei retired 8 months after the Ember Throne. She was not one for ceremonies, and managed to avoid most of the ones planned in her honor. She went home, to the surface, to a city that was being repopulated, now that the need for secrecy was over, to a small house near the coast, where the mornings were cool, and the sea was loud. On her first morning back, she stood outside before the sun was fully up and looked at the sky. It was going from dark to gray to the first pale colors of dawn. The stars were fading as they always did, one by one, retreating before the light. She had stood under this sky as a child and wondered what was out there. She had the answer now. The answer was complicated, and some of it was frightening, and some of it was worse than frightening, and some of it, the Vorath ambassador's face when he watched 40,000 people volunteer, Fatumata in the corner, reading her poems, Sithar's quiet confusion at being offered food. Some of it was something she did not have a clean word for. She thought about the 12 names. She thought about them every day. She expected she always would. The sky was getting lighter. Down the coast, something